The yellow school bus erupted in flames as it careened off Highway 34, crashing through the guardrail and rolling down the embankment like a burning coffin filled with screaming children. Frank Miller slammed on his brakes, watching in absolute horror as thick black smoke poured from the twisted metal wreckage below. Inside that inferno, 38 children were trapped, including two 7-year-old twin girls whose mother owned the largest hospital network in America. Frank had no idea that diving into those flames would change his life forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story moves you the way it moved us, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something absolutely mind-blowing waiting for you. Frank Miller never considered himself a hero. At 35, he was just a man trying to make it through each day without falling apart completely. The alarm clock's piercing shriek cut through the pre-dawn darkness of his cramped apartment in Millfield Heights at exactly 4:45 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 2 years. His calloused hand reached across the narrow twin bed, fingers automatically finding the worn plastic button with the muscle memory of someone who had perfected the art of surviving on 4 hours of sleep. The silence that followed was filled with the gentle breathing of his 8-year-old daughter Emma from the adjoining room, a sound that had become his anchor in a world that seemed determined to test every ounce of strength he possessed. Frank sat up slowly, his back protesting with sharp reminders of yesterday's grueling shift at the Riverside construction site, followed by 6 hours of overnight custodial work at Millfield General Hospital. His hands, permanently stained with honest dirt and bearing fresh cuts from yesterday's concrete work, rubbed the exhaustion from his dark brown eyes. Their apartment wasn't much to look at. 2 small bedrooms in a converted duplex overlooking the industrial district of Millfield Heights, where the morning air carried the metallic tang of the nearby steel foundry. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person, with cabinets that hung slightly askew and a refrigerator that hummed with the determined persistence of a machine refusing to give up despite its age. But it was theirs, and in a life where ownership of anything felt like a luxury, that counted for everything. Frank moved through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that every minute mattered when the next paycheck was still 4 days away. He measured coffee with the careful precision of a man who knew that every grain counted, using the same dented percolator that had survived his divorce 3 years ago. One of the few things Patricia had let him keep when she'd taken Emma to live with her successful new husband in the suburbs of Cedar Valley. Millfield Heights had once been a thriving blue-collar community, built around the Riverside Steelworks that had employed nearly half the town's population for 4 generations. The plant's closure 18 months ago had left behind empty storefronts, houses with "for sale" signs that never came down, and people like Frank who stayed because leaving required resources they simply didn't have. The town sat in the shadow of the Allegheny Mountains, its streets lined with modest homes where working families had once built solid, predictable lives around steady paychecks and union benefits. Frank's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man who looked older than his 35 years. His dark hair was showing premature streaks of silver at the temples, and his brown eyes carried the weight of responsibilities that had aged him beyond his time. The face looking back at him was honest and weathered, the kind of features that spoke of work done with his hands, of dignity found in labor that others might overlook, of a man who had learned that being a good father had nothing to do with the size of his bank account. The sound of small feet padding across the hallway announced Emma's arrival in the kitchen. Her auburn hair was tousled from sleep, and she wore the oversized t-shirt from last year's school fundraiser that served as her favorite pajamas. Emma was small for her age, a fact that worried Frank more than he let on, but her green eyes held an intelligence and warmth that reminded him daily why every sacrifice was worth making. "Morning, kiddo," Frank said, ruffling her hair as she climbed onto the wobbly kitchen chair they'd rescued from a garage sale. "Sleep okay?" "Mm-hmm," Emma mumbled, still shaking off the remnants of dreams. "Can we have pancakes?" Frank opened the refrigerator and took mental inventory. 2 eggs, half a carton of milk that would expire tomorrow, and a loaf of bread with 4 slices remaining. Pancakes weren't in the budget this morning, but the look of hopeful expectation in his daughter's eyes made him recalculate. There was flour in the cabinet, and he could stretch the milk with a little water. Emma's happiness was worth more than his morning coffee. "Pancakes it is," he said, already reaching for the mixing bowl, "but you've got to help me make them." Their morning ritual unfolded with the comfortable familiarity of a dance they'd performed countless times since Emma had come to live with him full-time 6 months ago. She stood on a chair beside him, carefully measuring ingredients while Frank told her stories about his own childhood in Millfield Heights, about his grandmother's kitchen where the smell of fresh biscuits could wake the entire neighborhood, and where every meal was a celebration of family no matter how little money stretched the table. These moments were precious to Frank, islands of normalcy in a sea of constant worry about bills, custody arrangements, and whether he was providing enough for a little girl who deserved so much more than a father who worked 2 jobs and still struggled to make ends meet. Emma didn't know about the stack of overdue notices hidden in his bedroom drawer, or about the sleepless nights when he lay awake calculating whether they could afford new winter boots for her growing feet. "Daddy," Emma said, breaking into his thoughts as she carefully poured batter onto the hot griddle, "Mrs. Henderson says there's a new family that moved into the big house on Maple Ridge. The one with the fancy gate." Frank nodded, focusing on flipping the pancakes before they burned. The big house on Maple Ridge was the old Thornfield estate, a sprawling Tudor mansion that had sat empty for 3 years since the last owner moved to Florida. It was the kind of house that belonged to a different era, when Millfield Heights had money and hope in equal measure, before the steel plant closed and took the town's prosperity with it. "That's nice, honey. Maybe they'll have kids for you to play with." "Maybe," Emma said, but her tone suggested she wasn't holding her breath. In a town where young families left as soon as they could afford to, Emma had learned not to get too attached to the possibility of new friends. After breakfast, Frank packed Emma's lunch with the same careful attention he applied to everything else in their lives. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich cut into triangles because she claimed they tasted better that way, an apple from the marked-down bag he'd bought at Morrison's Market, and a juice box, the one small luxury he allowed himself to provide for her each day. He included a note, as he did every morning, usually something silly that would make her smile when she found it at lunchtime. The walk to Millfield Elementary took them through the heart of downtown, past storefronts that displayed going-out-of-business signs like white flags of surrender. Patterson's hardware store, where Frank's father had once bought supplies for weekend projects, had closed last month. The corner diner, where Frank had taken Emma for her birthday dinner, their one meal out that year, now sported plywood over its windows. But there were still signs of life and hope. Mrs. Chen's flower shop, where she grew the most beautiful roses Frank had ever seen in coffee cans behind the store. The public library, where Emma spent her afternoons when Frank worked late, reading everything she could get her hands on under the watchful eye of Miss Rodriguez, the librarian who had been there since Frank was Emma's age. At the school entrance, Frank knelt down to Emma's level, straightening her jacket and checking to make sure her backpack was properly zipped. This was their moment, 30 seconds of connection before the day pulled them in different directions. "Have a good day, kiddo. Learn something amazing." "I always do," she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. "Love you, Daddy." "Love you too, Emma, more than all the stars in the sky." She rolled her eyes at the familiar phrase, but Frank could see her smile as she ran toward the building where Mrs. Patterson, her second-grade teacher, stood greeting students with the kind of warmth that reminded Frank why he'd chosen to stay in Millfield Heights despite all its economic challenges. As Frank drove his 15-year-old Ford pickup toward the construction site, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him had learned to find dignity in struggle, had discovered that being a good father had everything to do with the size of his heart, and nothing to do with the size of his bank account. He'd made mistakes. God knew he'd made mistakes. But every decision for the past 3 years had been guided by one simple principle. Emma deserved the best father he could possibly be. Little did Frank Miller know that in just a few hours, a moment of instinctive courage would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his place in the world, about what he deserved, and about the kind of life that might be possible for a single father whose greatest treasure was an 8-year-old girl who believed her daddy could do anything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The construction site at Riverside Industrial Park buzzed with the familiar sounds of progress, concrete mixers churning, steel beams clanging into place, and the steady rhythm of hammers that had become the soundtrack of Frank Miller's survival. At 7:15 a.m. sharp, Frank pulled his battered pickup truck into the gravel lot, parking between two newer vehicles that belonged to workers whose circumstances hadn't been shattered by factory closures and economic downturn. Frank grabbed his hard hat and tool belt from the passenger seat, the leather worn smooth from 3 years of daily use. The weight of the tools felt comfortable in his hands, tangible proof that he could still provide for Emma through honest work, even when that work left his back aching and his hands raw by the end of each 12-hour shift. "Miller!" called out Tony Rossetti, the site foreman who had taken a chance on Frank when most employers saw only a laid-off steelworker with no formal construction training. "Need you on the foundation pour today. Rodriguez called in sick, so you're my lead concrete man." Frank nodded, grateful for the responsibility that came with extra pay. $25 more for the day that would cover Emma's school lunch account for 2 weeks. Every dollar mattered when your monthly budget was calculated down to the penny. When choosing between Emma's winter boots and the overdue electricity bill meant sleepless nights of worry and careful planning. The Riverside Industrial Park project represented hope for Millfield Heights, 3 new warehouse buildings that would bring jobs back to a community devastated by the steel plant closure. Frank took pride in knowing that his work would help rebuild the economic foundation of his hometown, that the concrete he poured and the walls he framed would provide employment for neighbors who had lost everything when Riverside Steel shuttered its doors. As Frank worked alongside the concrete crew, his mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with Emma's teacher the previous week. Mrs. Patterson had pulled him aside during pickup, her face showing the kind of concern that made Frank's stomach clench with parental anxiety. "Emma is exceptionally bright," Mrs. Patterson had said, choosing her words carefully. "Her reading comprehension is 3 grade levels above her peers, and her mathematical reasoning is remarkable for a 2nd grader. I'd like to recommend her for the district's gifted program." Frank had felt the familiar mixture of pride and panic that came with recognition of Emma's potential. Pride because his daughter was extraordinary, capable of achievements that would open doors he'd never been able to walk through himself. Panic because the gifted program required transportation to Cedar Valley Elementary, additional supplies, and extracurricular activities that cost money he simply didn't have. What would that involve? Frank had asked, though he already suspected the answer would stretch their budget beyond breaking point. Special classes 3 days a week, advanced materials, and summer enrichment programs. There are scholarships available for families with financial need, Mrs. Patterson had added gently, recognizing the conflict in Frank's expression. The word, scholarship, carried weight that went beyond financial assistance. It meant filling out forms that documented exactly how little they had, answering questions about his employment history and custody arrangements, submitting to evaluation by people who would judge whether he was providing adequately for his daughter's intellectual development. Frank had thanked Mrs. Patterson and promised to consider the opportunity, but the application sat unopened in his kitchen drawer beside the overdue notices and custody modification papers that arrived monthly from Patricia's lawyer. Each document represented a choice between Emma's immediate needs and her long-term potential, between maintaining their current stability and risking change that might improve her future but threaten their present security. The lunch whistle blew at noon, and Frank found a shaded spot behind the concrete mixer to eat the bologna sandwich he'd packed in the same brown bag Emma used for school lunches. Around him, other workers gathered in small groups, sharing stories about weekend plans and complaining about the heat. Frank listened without contributing, understanding that his circumstances set him apart from men who went home to 2-parent households and steady paychecks. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Daddy, I got 100% on my spelling test. Mrs. Patterson says I can help other kids with reading time. Love you." Frank smiled, typing back, "So proud of you, kiddo. You're going to change the world someday. Love you more than all the stars." The exchange filled him with the familiar combination of joy and determination that sustained him through the most difficult moments. Emma's success validated every sacrifice, every double shift, every night when he fell asleep at the kitchen table while helping her with homework. She was thriving despite their circumstances, growing into the kind of person who would help others and make a positive difference in the world. At 3:30 p.m., Frank's shift ended, but his day was far from over. He had exactly 20 minutes to drive across town to Millfield Elementary, pick up Emma, and get her settled at the library before racing to his evening job at Millfield General Hospital. The timing required military precision, leaving no margin for traffic delays or unexpected complications. Emma was waiting by the school entrance when Frank pulled up, her backpack organized and her homework folder already in hand. She climbed into the pickup truck with the efficiency of someone who understood that every minute of her father's schedule mattered. "How was school, kiddo?" "Good. We learned about the water cycle, and I finished my math worksheet early, so Mrs. Patterson let me help Sarah with her subtraction problems. She's getting better. She only needed help with 3 problems today instead of 7. Frank listened to Emma's detailed account of her day, marveling at her natural inclination to help struggling classmates rather than seeking recognition for her own advanced abilities. She possessed an emotional intelligence that complemented her academic gifts, an intuitive understanding of how to make others feel valued and supported. The Millfield Public Library occupied a Carnegie building from 1903, its stone facade weathered but dignified, like an elderly relative who maintained pride despite diminished circumstances. Miss Rodriguez greeted Emma with the warmth of someone who had watched her progress from picture books to chapter novels over the past 2 years. "Your usual table is available," Miss Rodriguez told Emma, gesturing toward the corner spot by the window where Emma spent her afternoons reading and working on homework while Frank finished his evening shift at the hospital. "I brought my science project notes," Emma said, pulling a carefully organized folder from her backpack. "I'm researching renewable energy sources for our Earth Day presentation." Frank kissed Emma's forehead and promised to return by 8:30 p.m., the same promise he made every weekday evening. Emma would spend the next 5 hours surrounded by books and supervised by Miss Rodriguez, safe in an environment that nurtured her intellectual curiosity, while Frank earned the additional income that kept their small household afloat. The drive to Millfield General Hospital took Frank through the wealthier section of town, where houses sat on landscaped lots behind iron gates and circular driveways. The contrast between these neighborhoods and his own apartment complex was stark, a daily reminder of the economic divide that separated Emma's current reality from the opportunities available to children whose parents could afford private tutoring, enrichment programs, and college preparation courses. Millfield General Hospital had been struggling financially since the steel plant closure reduced the number of residents with employer-provided health insurance. The facility operated with skeleton crews and outdated equipment, serving a community that needed medical care but often couldn't afford to pay for it. Frank's custodial work helped maintain the hospital's basic cleanliness standards while providing him with steady evening employment that didn't conflict with his construction schedule. As Frank changed into his maintenance uniform in the hospital's employee locker room, he thought about the application for Emma's gifted program that remained hidden in his kitchen drawer. The deadline was approaching, and he would soon need to make a decision that could affect Emma's entire educational trajectory. The rational part of his mind understood that Emma deserved every opportunity to develop her remarkable abilities. The practical part worried about transportation logistics, additional costs, and the time away from home that might destabilize their carefully constructed routine. Most troubling was the fear that accepting help might trigger renewed custody challenges from Patricia, who had never stopped believing that Emma would be better off in her suburban household with 2 parents and unlimited resources. Frank began his evening rounds, pushing the custodial cart through hospital corridors while thinking about the choices that shaped a child's future. Emma was happy in their small apartment, thriving academically despite their limited resources, and secure in the knowledge that she was loved completely. But was love enough when faced with opportunities that could transform her life? And could Frank afford to take risks that might threaten the stability they had worked so hard to achieve? As he mopped the floors of Millfield General Hospital, Frank Miller had no idea that in just a few hours, those same corridors would become the setting for events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about sacrifice, opportunity, and the kind of life that might be possible for a single father and his extraordinary daughter. Dr. Victoria Ashworth stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 42nd floor of Ashworth Medical Tower, watching the sunrise paint the skyline of downtown metropolitan city in shades of gold and crimson. The view was spectacular, a carefully curated panorama of success that included the corporate headquarters of 3 Fortune 500 companies and the gleaming spires of the financial district where millions of dollars changed hands every minute. But this morning, surrounded by awards from medical journals and photographs with senators and governors, Victoria felt the familiar hollow echo of achievements that impressed everyone except the 2 people who mattered most. At 42, Dr. Victoria Ashworth commanded an empire that stretched across 17 states. Ashworth Medical Systems owned or operated 847 hospitals, employed over 400,000 healthcare workers, and generated annual revenues that exceeded the GDP of several small nations. She had built this network from a single struggling community hospital she'd inherited from her father 15 years ago, transforming it through aggressive acquisition, innovative management, and an almost supernatural ability to identify healthcare markets that others overlooked. The business magazines called her the hospital whisperer for her talent at turning failing medical facilities into profitable enterprises while maintaining quality patient care. Forbes had featured her on their cover as the woman who's revolutionizing American healthcare. Time magazine had named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world, recognizing her work in bringing advanced medical services to underserved rural communities. None of those accolades helped her understand why her 7-year-old twin daughters, Lily and Rose, seemed more comfortable with their nanny than with their own mother. Victoria's reflection in the window showed a woman who had learned to armor herself in designer suits and perfect composure, whose business acumen had earned respect in boardrooms where men twice her age deferred to her judgment, but whose maternal instincts felt as fragile as surgical thread. She possessed 3 doctoral degrees, medicine, business administration, and healthcare policy, but couldn't figure out how to connect with 2 little girls who shared her DNA but seemed to inhabit a completely different emotional universe. The twins were asleep in the penthouse apartment 20 floors above her office, where they lived in luxury that most children could only imagine. Their bedrooms were decorated by the same designer who had created playrooms for Hollywood celebrities. Their toy collections included educational materials recommended by child development experts and play equipment that cost more than most families spent on cars. They attended Whitmore Academy, the most exclusive private school in Metropolitan City, where tuition exceeded the annual income of 90% of American families. Yet Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing from their lives. Something that had nothing to do with material advantages and everything to do with the kind of maternal presence she'd never learned to provide naturally. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could diagnose complex medical conditions affecting thousands of patients, but struggled to understand what her own daughters needed from her emotionally. Victoria approached parenting with the same systematic analysis she applied to business challenges, reading research studies about child psychology, and consulting with pediatric experts about optimal developmental strategies. But Lily and Rose seemed to crave something simpler and more elusive, the kind of effortless maternal warmth that came naturally to other mothers, but felt like speaking a foreign language to Victoria. Her assistant, Margaret Clearwater, knocked softly on the office door, carrying the leather portfolio that contained Victoria's daily schedule and the expression of someone who had learned to read her employer's moods with scientific precision. Margaret had worked for Victoria for 8 years, since just after the twins were born, and had become something between a personal secretary and a trusted confidant. One of the few people who understood that Victoria's legendary focus sometimes masked a loneliness that even unprecedented success couldn't fill. "Good morning, Dr. Ashworth," Margaret said carefully, setting down a cup of coffee, prepared exactly the way Victoria preferred it. "The girls are having breakfast with Mrs. Chen. I've confirmed your 9 o'clock meeting with the Seattle acquisition team, and the board presentation has been moved to Thursday as requested." Victoria nodded, grateful for Margaret's ability to manage the countless details that allowed her to function efficiently when personal concerns threatened to overwhelm her professional responsibilities. The Seattle acquisition represented Victoria's most ambitious project yet, purchasing a failing hospital system and transforming it into a model for sustainable rural healthcare delivery. The project would create jobs, improve medical services for underserved communities, and demonstrate that profitability and patient care could coexist successfully. "What's the status on the Metropolitan Children's Hospital expansion?" Victoria asked, reviewing notes for her first meeting while thinking about the new pediatric wing that would serve families throughout the region. "Construction is ahead of schedule, and the equipment installation begins next month. Dr. Martinez wants to discuss the specialized care unit configurations with you this afternoon." Victoria felt a familiar sense of satisfaction at the progress report. The Metropolitan Children's Hospital expansion represented her commitment to providing world-class pediatric care in communities that had traditionally been underserved by major medical centers. The facility would include specialized treatment areas for childhood cancer, cardiac surgery, and neurological disorders, services that currently required families to travel hundreds of miles to access. "Have you scheduled the site visit for next week?" "Tuesday at 2 p.m. I've arranged for the architect and chief medical officer to provide a complete tour of the new facilities. As Margaret left to coordinate the morning's appointments, Victoria found herself thinking about the children who would benefit from the expanded hospital services, families who faced medical crises with courage and determination, despite limited financial resources. She understood the clinical aspects of pediatric care with expert precision, but the emotional dimensions of childhood illness and family trauma remained territories where her professional expertise felt inadequate. The intercom buzzed with a call from Mrs. Chen, the nanny who had become indispensable to their household management. "Dr. Ashworth, Lily would like to speak with you before school." Victoria felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied unscripted conversations with her daughters. "Put her through." "Mommy?" Lily's 7-year-old voice carried the serious tone she used when discussing important matters. "Rose and I want to know if you can come to our school play next Friday. We're both trees in the forest scene." Victoria consulted her calendar, noting the overlap with a crucial board meeting that would determine funding for 3 new hospital acquisitions. "What time is the performance, sweetheart?" 2 o'clock. Mrs. Patterson says all the other mommies and daddies are coming. We made special invitations with glitter and everything. The hope in Lily's voice was unmistakable, and Victoria felt the weight of another choice between professional obligations and maternal presence. The board meeting could potentially be rescheduled, but doing so would signal to investors that personal considerations took precedence over business commitments, a perception that could undermine her authority in future negotiations. "I'll do my best to be there," Victoria said, immediately regretting the qualification that left room for disappointment. "Promise?" Lily pressed with the persistence of someone who had learned that adult promises sometimes came with invisible conditions. "I promise I'll try very hard," Victoria said, offering the most honest commitment she could make while knowing that her 7-year-old daughter deserved better than conditional love. After the call ended, Victoria stood at her window overlooking the city where thousands of people depended on her decisions for their healthcare and employment. She commanded resources that could solve almost any problem, influence legislation that affected millions of lives, and create opportunities that transformed entire communities. But she couldn't figure out how to be the kind of mother who attended school plays without calculating the business cost of her presence. The photograph on her desk showed Lily and Rose at last year's Christmas party, dressed in matching red velvet dresses and smiling with the kind of innocent joy that seemed to become more elusive as they grew older and more aware of their mother's divided attention. Victoria had commissioned the portrait from the same photographer who created annual reports for major corporations. But the formal composition couldn't capture the spontaneous affection that should have existed between mother and daughters. Victoria's phone rang with the first of what would be dozens of calls throughout the day, board meetings to conduct, acquisition strategies to approve, personnel decisions that affected thousands of employees across her hospital network. The business world demanded constant motion, perpetual availability, an endless stream of choices that shaped markets and influenced lives she would never meet personally. But as Victoria prepared for another day of managing her medical empire, she wondered if success measured in dollars and hospital beds could ever compensate for the growing distance she felt from Lily and Rose, who seemed to need something she didn't know how to provide. The school play invitation sat on her desk like a small test of her priorities, a 7-year-old's challenge to prove that some things mattered more than board meetings and acquisition strategies. Outside her window, Metropolitan City awakened to another day of commerce and ambition, while 20 floors above, 2 little girls finished breakfast and prepared for school, unaware that their mother was about to face a day that would challenge everything she thought she understood about success, sacrifice, and the kind of love that couldn't be purchased with any amount of money. The emergency call crackled through Frank Miller's construction radio at 2:47 p.m., just as he was securing the final steel beam on the warehouse frame. Tony Rossetti's voice carried an urgency that made every worker on the site stop what they were doing and listen with the focused attention reserved for genuine crisis. "All available personnel, we've got a major incident on Highway 34 near the Millfield Elementary exit. School bus collision with multiple casualties. They're requesting anyone with first aid certification or emergency response experience to assist at the scene immediately." Frank's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Highway 34 was the exact route that Emma's school bus took every afternoon at 3:15 p.m. He dropped his welding torch and sprinted toward his pickup truck, his work boots echoing against the concrete as other construction workers called out questions he couldn't hear over the roar of panic flooding his nervous system. The drive to the crash site took 6 minutes that felt like 6 hours. Frank's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he navigated through the growing convoy of emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights painting the gray October afternoon in urgent, pulsing colors. His mind raced through terrible possibilities while his heart hammered against his ribs with the desperate rhythm of a father whose worst nightmares might be unfolding just ahead. The scene that greeted Frank at the Highway 34 overpass made his heart stop completely. A yellow school bus lay on its side in the ravine below the roadway, thick black smoke pouring from its engine compartment while orange flames licked hungrily at the twisted metal frame. The impact had shattered most of the windows, and through the broken glass, Frank could see the chaos inside. Children's faces pressed against the few remaining intact windows, some crying, others eerily silent with shock. "Emma!" Frank shouted, pushing through the crowd of paramedics and police officers who were still assessing the situation and coordinating their response. "My daughter's on that bus. Emma Miller, she's 8 years old. Auburn hair, she sits in the 3rd row." A young paramedic placed a firm hand on Frank's chest, preventing him from charging down the embankment toward the burning wreckage. "Sir, we're handling the evacuation. The fire department is setting up extraction equipment, but you need to stay back for your own safety." "That's my daughter in there," Frank said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I have to help her." "Sir, we understand, but running into that situation won't help anyone. The professionals are." Frank's response was cut off by the sight of 2 small faces pressed against the rear emergency window of the bus. Twin girls, maybe 7 years old, with identical expressions of helpless terror as dark smoke began filling the passenger compartment around them. They weren't Emma, but in that moment of crisis they might as well have been. Every paternal instinct Frank possessed screamed that children were in mortal danger, while adults stood around debating safety protocols and proper procedures. The fire was spreading faster than the rescue team had anticipated. Frank could see that the emergency responders were still unloading specialized equipment from their vehicles, following careful procedures designed to maximize safety while minimizing risk to rescue personnel. But those procedures took time, and the children trapped inside the bus didn't have time. The smoke was getting thicker, and Frank could hear the sound of metal groaning as the fire weakened the vehicle's structural integrity. Frank looked at the twin girls in the window, their faces pale with terror, their small hands pressed against the glass in silent pleading, and made a decision that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. He kicked off his steel-toed work boots and sprinted down the embankment toward the burning bus, ignoring the shouts of emergency personnel behind him. The heat hit Frank like a physical wall as he approached the wreckage. The flames had spread from the engine compartment to the front passenger area, and the acrid smell of burning diesel fuel and melting plastic filled his lungs with every breath. But Frank had grown up in Millfield Heights, had spent countless summer afternoons swimming in Miller's Pond and climbing the steep hills that surrounded their town. His body knew how to move through dangerous terrain, even when that terrain was a burning school bus, surrounded by twisted metal and broken glass. Frank reached the rear emergency window where the twin girls were trapped. Up close, he could see that they were identical twins with dark hair and brown eyes, probably 1st or 2nd graders based on their size. One girl was trying to comfort the other, even though both were clearly terrified by the smoke and flames surrounding them. "It's okay," Frank called through the window, his voice barely audible over the sound of crackling flames and distant sirens. "I'm gonna get you out of here." "What are your names?" "I'm Lily," said one girl, her voice small but surprisingly calm. "This is my sister Rose. Is our mommy coming?" "Your mommy will meet us at the hospital," Frank promised, working to pry open the emergency window release mechanism. "Right now, I need you both to be very brave for me. Can you do that?" Both girls nodded, and Frank felt his heart constrict at their trust in a complete stranger who was asking them to believe that everything would be okay when their world was literally on fire around them. The emergency window finally gave way, swinging open with a rush of hot air and smoke that made Frank's eyes water. He reached through the opening and lifted Lily first, her small body surprisingly light as he pulled her through the window frame. She clung to him with desperate strength, her fingernails digging into his shoulders as he positioned her safely on his back. "Hold on tight," he told her. "Don't let go no matter what happens." Rose came next, her eyes wide with terror that reminded Frank of Emma during thunderstorms when she would crawl into his bed and bury her face against his chest until the scary sounds passed. Frank managed to position both girls so they could hold onto him while leaving his arms free for the climb back to safety. The journey back up the embankment was the most physically demanding challenge of Frank's life. His muscles were cramping from the heat and smoke inhalation, and the added weight of two 7-year-old girls made each step feel like climbing a mountain. Halfway up the slope, his left leg seized with a cramp so severe that he nearly collapsed, saved only by the desperate grip of small hands on his shoulders and the knowledge that giving up wasn't an option. "Almost there," he gasped, as much to himself as to the children on his back. "Almost safe." The rescue team was waiting at the top of the embankment, paramedics rushing forward to meet them with blankets and oxygen masks. Frank felt hands grabbing him, pulling him and the twins toward the waiting ambulances where medical professionals could assess their condition and treat any injuries from smoke inhalation or heat exposure. "Emma," Frank called out as emergency workers wrapped him in a thermal blanket. "Where's my daughter? Is Emma Miller safe?" A familiar voice answered from behind him. "She's fine, Mr. Miller. Emma wasn't on the bus today." Frank turned to see Miss Rodriguez, the librarian, her face etched with concern but her eyes reassuring. "Early dismissal for teacher conferences, remember? Emma's been at the library with me all afternoon, working on her science project." The relief that washed over Frank was so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Emma was safe. The other children were being evacuated by the professional rescue team who had finally gotten their equipment in position. And the twin girls he'd pulled from the wreckage were alive, breathing, their small bodies warming under emergency blankets while paramedics checked their vital signs. "You saved them," one of the paramedics said, checking Frank's pulse and examining his eyes for signs of smoke inhalation. "That was incredibly brave. Incredibly dangerous, but brave." Frank didn't feel brave. He felt exhausted and slightly nauseous from the adrenaline crash that was beginning to set in. But when he looked at Lily and Rose sitting nearby, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot chocolate that someone had produced from an emergency supply kit, he felt something else. A quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he'd done the right thing, regardless of the personal risk involved. "What are their last names?" Frank asked the paramedic who was monitoring the twins' condition. "Ashworth," the man replied, making notes on his medical chart. "Lily and Rose Ashworth. Their mother's been contacted and is on her way from Metropolitan City." Frank nodded, too tired to process the significance of the name or wonder why two children from the wealthy section of town were riding a Millfield elementary school bus. All that mattered was that they were safe, breathing, and would be reunited with their mother soon. As Frank sat on the tailgate of an ambulance watching the professional rescue operation extract the remaining children from the burned-out school bus, he had no idea that he had just saved the daughters of the most powerful woman in American healthcare, or that this moment of instinctive courage would soon transform his life in ways he could never have imagined. Dr. Victoria Ashworth's hands were trembling as she ended the call from Millfield General Hospital. The words, "bus accident," "smoke inhalation," and "your daughters," had shattered her afternoon board meeting like a glass hitting concrete. She had excused herself from the conference room full of hospital executives and acquisition specialists, leaving behind spreadsheets and strategic plans that suddenly seemed as meaningless as yesterday's newspaper. The helicopter ride from Metropolitan City to Millfield Heights took 18 minutes. 18 minutes during which Victoria experienced every parent's worst nightmare in slow motion. She sat in the leather passenger seat of her corporate helicopter, watching the landscape blur beneath them while imagining scenarios that made her chest tighten with fear. Lily and Rose had been attending Millfield Elementary for only 2 weeks, part of Victoria's misguided attempt to give them a, quote, normal school experience away from the privileged bubble of Whitmore Academy. Now she wondered if her decision to enroll them in a public school had nearly cost them their lives. The Millfield General Hospital emergency room was controlled chaos when Victoria arrived. She moved through the automatic doors with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of medical situations. But this time she wasn't the doctor in command. She was just another terrified parent searching for her children among the beds and gurneys filled with young accident victims. "Dr. Ashworth?" A nurse approached her with the deferential tone that Victoria usually heard from hospital staff who recognized her name and reputation. "Your daughters are in treatment room 3. Dr. Matthews is examining them now." Victoria followed the nurse through corridors that reminded her of the dozens of similar hospitals she owned throughout the region. The institutional green walls, the smell of disinfectant, the constant beeping of medical equipment, all familiar elements that usually represented professional success and community service. Today they felt like barriers between her and the two people who mattered most in the world. Treatment Room 3 contained a scene that stopped Victoria's breath entirely. Lily and Rose sat side by side on an examination table, still wearing their Millfield Elementary uniforms but wrapped in hospital blankets that made them look even smaller than their 7 years. Their faces showed the pale, shell-shocked expression of children who had experienced something far beyond their understanding, but they were alert, breathing, and, most importantly, alive. "Mommy," Rose called out, reaching toward Victoria with arms that trembled slightly from residual shock. Victoria gathered both girls into an embrace that was fierce with relief and desperate love. For the first time in months, the distance she usually felt between herself and her daughters evaporated completely. They were warm and solid and breathing in her arms, and nothing else in the universe mattered except the fact that they had survived something that could have taken them away from her forever. "Are you hurt?" Victoria asked, pulling back to examine their faces for injuries while her medical training automatically assessed their condition. "Do you have any pain? Any trouble breathing?" "We're okay, Mommy," Lily said, her voice smaller than usual but steady. "The man saved us from the fire. He climbed through the window and carried us out like a real hero." "What man?" Victoria asked, looking toward Dr. Matthews, who had been quietly observing the reunion from across the room. "A construction worker named Frank Miller," Dr. Matthews explained, consulting his chart. "He pulled your daughters from the burning bus before our emergency responders could set up their extraction equipment. Remarkable courage, really. The girls have minor smoke inhalation but no serious injuries thanks to his quick action." Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that her daughters' lives had been saved by a stranger who had risked his own safety without expecting anything in return. Someone had seen Lily and Rose in mortal danger, and had acted with the kind of selfless courage that seemed increasingly rare in her world of calculated risks and strategic decision-making. "Where is he now?" Victoria asked. "I need to thank him." "He left about an hour ago," Dr. Matthews said. "Didn't want any special recognition or media attention, just wanted to make sure your daughters were okay before he went home to his own family." Victoria processed this information with the analytical part of her mind that never completely shut down. A man who rescued children from a burning bus and then disappeared without seeking recognition or reward was either genuinely humble or strategically positioning himself for later advantage. Her business experience had taught her to question everyone's motives, but something about this situation felt different from the corporate manipulation she encountered daily. "Tell me about the fire," Victoria said, sitting on the edge of the examination table so she could maintain physical contact with Lily and Rose while gathering details about what had happened. "It was scary, Mommy," Rose said, leaning against Victoria's shoulder. "The bus was making loud noises and then there was smoke everywhere. Lily and I couldn't get out because the door was stuck." "But then the man came," Lily continued, picking up the story with the tag team narrative style the twins had developed. "He talked to us through the window and told us everything was going to be okay. He promised that you would meet us at the hospital." Victoria felt her throat tighten at the image of her daughters trapped in a burning vehicle, depending on a stranger's promise that their mother would be there for them. The promise had been kept, but Victoria couldn't shake the awareness that she had been 20 miles away in a boardroom when her children had faced the most dangerous moment of their lives. "What did this man look like?" Victoria asked, driven by a need to understand who had saved her daughters. "He was nice," Rose said with 7-year-old directness. "He had kind eyes and work clothes with dirt on them. He wasn't scared even though there was fire everywhere." "He told us to be brave," Lily added, "and he kept his promise about getting us to safety. I think he has a little girl too, because he knew exactly how to talk to us." Victoria made mental notes about these details while marveling at her daughters' ability to assess character even in moments of crisis. Lily and Rose were usually shy around strangers, particularly men, but they had trusted Frank Miller completely during their rescue. That trust suggested something authentic about his character that went beyond the heroic circumstances. Dr. Matthews completed his examination and confirmed that both girls could be discharged with instructions for monitoring any delayed symptoms of smoke inhalation. Victoria signed the necessary paperwork while thinking about the man who had saved her daughters and then vanished before she could properly express her gratitude. "I want to find him," Victoria told Margaret Clearwater, who had arrived at the hospital with a change of clothes for the girls and Victoria's personal security detail. "Frank Miller. I need his contact information." "I'll have our security team locate him," Margaret said, making notes on her tablet with the efficiency that made her indispensable to Victoria's daily operations. It shouldn't be difficult in a town this size. As Victoria prepared to take Lily and Rose home, she found herself thinking about the debt she owed to a stranger whose quick action had prevented the loss of everything that truly mattered in her life. Her hospital empire, her professional achievements, her carefully constructed success, all of it would have been meaningless if something had happened to her daughters. The helicopter ride back to Metropolitan City was subdued. Lily and Rose sat quietly beside Victoria, occasionally reaching for her hand, as if confirming that she was really there. Victoria found herself studying their faces, memorizing details she usually overlooked in the rush of daily responsibilities. Rose had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a playground accident when she was 4. Lily's hair had natural highlights that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the helicopter windows. How many similar details had she missed while focusing on hospital acquisitions and board presentations? How many moments of genuine connection had she sacrificed for professional obligations that now seemed trivial compared to the simple fact that her daughters were alive and safe? "Mommy," Lily said during the flight, "can we see the man who saved us again? I want to thank him properly." "And I want to give him a present," Rose added, "something special to show we're grateful." Victoria nodded, understanding that her daughters needed closure from their traumatic experience, but also recognizing her own need to meet the man who had risked his life for children he'd never seen before. Frank Miller had given her the greatest gift imaginable, her daughters' lives, and Victoria Ashworth was not someone who left debts unpaid. "We'll find him," Victoria promised, meaning it completely, "and we'll thank him the right way." As the skyline of Metropolitan City appeared ahead of them, Victoria realized that this day had changed something fundamental in her relationship with Lily and Rose. For the first time since their birth, they had needed her in a way that had nothing to do with providing material advantages or educational opportunities. They had needed their mother's presence, comfort, and unconditional love in the aftermath of genuine trauma. And Victoria had discovered that being needed in that way felt more important than any professional achievement she had ever accomplished. The address Margaret had provided led Victoria down a series of increasingly modest streets until she found herself in the Riverside Heights apartment complex, a cluster of converted duplexes that had seen better decades. The contrast between this neighborhood and her penthouse lifestyle was stark. Chain-link fences instead of manicured hedges, older model cars parked on gravel driveways, and the kind of practical functionality that spoke of people who made every dollar count. Victoria sat in her black Mercedes sedan for several minutes, studying the building directory until she found F. Miller Apt 2B listed in faded black letters on a plastic nameplate. Through her tinted windows, she could see children playing in a small courtyard where playground equipment showed signs of community maintenance rather than professional landscaping. This was a world away from the gated communities and private schools that defined her daughter's daily experience. Frank Miller answered his apartment door wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had been carefully mended at the elbow, clothes that were clean but showed the wear patterns of someone who owned a limited wardrobe. Up close, Victoria could see that he was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-30s, with calloused hands and the kind of weathered features that came from outdoor work. His expression showed surprise at finding an expensively dressed woman at his door, followed quickly by recognition. "Dr. Ashworth," he said, stepping back slightly as if her presence made him uncomfortable. "I wasn't expecting. How are Lily and Rose doing?" "They're fine, thanks to you," Victoria said, struck by the genuine concern in his voice. "Mr. Miller, I came to thank you personally for saving my daughters' lives. What you did yesterday took extraordinary courage." Frank shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone would do. Saw kids in trouble and helped. No big deal." "It's a very big deal to me," Victoria insisted. "You risked your life for children you'd never met. That's not something I can just say thank you for and walk away." "You just did say thank you," Frank pointed out with a slight smile. "That's all I needed to hear." Before Victoria could respond, A young girl appeared in the doorway behind Frank, auburn hair tied back in a ponytail, green eyes bright with curiosity, wearing a school uniform that had been carefully maintained but showed signs of daily wear. This had to be Emma, Frank's daughter, who studied Victoria with the Frank assessment that 8-year-olds reserved for unexpected visitors. "Daddy, who's the fancy lady?" Emma asked with 8-year-old directness. "Emma, this is Dr. Ashworth," Frank said, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "She's the mother of the little girls I helped yesterday." Emma's eyes widened with interest. "The twins from the bus fire? Are they okay? I was worried about them all night." Victoria felt something unexpected stir in her chest at this child's genuine concern for daughters she'd never met. "They're perfectly fine, thanks to your father. They've been asking about him constantly since yesterday." "That's good," Emma said with obvious relief. "Daddy says that when people get hurt, it's important to make sure they're really okay, not just pretend okay." The wisdom in this observation, delivered with such natural empathy, surprised Victoria. She found herself studying Emma Miller with the same analytical attention she usually reserved for business assessments. This was a child who had been raised to consider other people's welfare, to think beyond her own immediate concerns, to understand that emotional healing was as important as physical recovery. "Emma, why don't you show Dr. Ashworth your science project?" Frank suggested, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from yesterday's heroics. Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm. "It's about renewable energy sources. I'm researching how solar panels and wind turbines can help communities become self-sufficient." "Want to see?" Victoria nodded, genuinely curious about what kind of academic work this child was producing. Emma led them into the small living room where a careful display covered most of the dining table. Hand-drawn charts showing energy production statistics, photographs cut from magazines depicting different renewable technologies, and a written report that demonstrated research skills far beyond typical second-grade level. "This is remarkable," Victoria said, examining Emma's work with growing amazement. "You've obviously put tremendous effort into understanding some very complex concepts." "Emma's gifted," Frank said quietly, pride evident in his voice despite his attempt at modesty. "Her teacher recommended her for the district's advanced program, but we're still figuring out the logistics." Victoria recognized the careful phrasing that parents used when discussing opportunities they couldn't afford. The gifted program would require transportation, additional materials, and extracurricular activities that stretched budgets already calculated down to the penny. She had seen similar situations countless times in the communities where her hospitals operated. Brilliant children whose potential was limited by economic circumstances rather than intellectual capacity. "What kind of logistics?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Transportation mostly," Frank said, his tone carefully neutral. "The program is based in Cedar Valley, and my work schedule makes it difficult to provide regular transportation. We're exploring options." Emma was studying Victoria with the perceptive attention of someone who understood adult conversations had layers of meaning beyond the actual words spoken. "Daddy works really hard," she said loyally. "He has 2 jobs so we can have our own apartment and I can go to school with my friends." Victoria felt another unexpected stir of emotion at this child's protective loyalty toward her father. Emma clearly understood their financial constraints, but framed them in terms of Frank's dedication rather than limitation. She had learned to find pride in their circumstances rather than shame, to appreciate what they had rather than focus on what they lacked. "Your father is obviously an exceptional man," Victoria said, meaning it completely, "and you're an exceptional young lady. Your science project demonstrates college-level research skills." "Really?" Emma's face glowed with pleasure at the assessment. "I want to be a scientist when I grow up. Maybe invent new ways to help people, like Daddy does." "How does your daddy help people?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious about Emma's perspective on Frank's work. "Well, yesterday he saved those little girls from the fire," Emma said matter-of-factly. "But he helps people every day, too. He builds things that give people jobs, and he cleans the hospitals so sick people have a safe place to get better. Daddy says every job that helps other people is important, even if some people don't notice." Victoria found herself moved by this 8-year-old's sophisticated understanding of service and community contribution. Emma had been taught to see her father's work in terms of its positive impact, rather than its economic limitations, to understand that dignity came from helping others rather than from salary or social status. Honkaratipas. Emma's right, Frank said, clearly embarrassed by his daughter's praise but unable to contradict her assessment. Every honest job has value if it makes things better for someone else. Victoria realized she was witnessing something she rarely encountered in her professional world, a parent who had taught their child to find meaning in service rather than personal advancement, to measure success by contribution rather than compensation. Frank Miller had created a household where values mattered more than income, where character was more important than circumstances. "I'd like to do something to thank you properly," Victoria said, returning to her original purpose while understanding that direct financial assistance would be refused. "Perhaps we could arrange a playdate for the girls. Lily and Rose have been asking about meeting Emma, and I think they could all benefit from the friendship." Frank considered this suggestion carefully, clearly weighing the potential complications of social interaction between children from such different economic backgrounds. "I don't want Emma to feel uncomfortable about our circumstances," he said finally. "From what I've observed, Emma seems perfectly comfortable with who she is," Victoria replied. "I think my daughters could learn a great deal from her confidence and perspective." Emma bounced slightly with excitement at the prospect of new friends. "Could they come here to play? I could show them my rock collection and teach them how to make friendship bracelets. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me the pattern at the library." Victoria looked around the small apartment with its carefully maintained furniture and Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, recognizing something that had been missing from her daughters: experience, the warmth that came from a home where people genuinely enjoyed each other's company, where love was expressed through attention rather than expensive gifts. "I think that sounds perfect," Victoria said, understanding that she was about to enter a relationship that would challenge her assumptions about success, happiness, and what children actually needed to thrive. As Victoria prepared to leave, she realized that Frank Miller had given her something beyond saving her daughters' lives. He had shown her what authentic parenting looked like, what it meant to raise a child who was confident, compassionate, and grounded in values that couldn't be purchased with any amount of money. The debt she owed him was becoming more complex than simple gratitude for heroic action. It was beginning to look like an opportunity to learn something essential about the kind of mother she wanted to become. The playground at Millfield Elementary had been Victoria's first glimpse into the world Frank and Emma inhabited daily, a world where community mattered more than individual advantage, where children played together regardless of their parents' economic circumstances, where relationships were built through shared experiences rather than calculated networking. Now, 3 weeks after that initial meeting, Victoria found herself genuinely invested in a friendship that had surprised everyone involved. Lily and Rose had embraced Emma with the enthusiasm of children who had finally found someone who treated them like normal kids, rather than the daughters of a medical empire CEO. Emma, in turn, had welcomed the twins into her world with the generous spirit Frank had cultivated in her, showing them how to find beauty in simple pleasures, how to create games from imagination rather than expensive toys. Victoria had spent Saturday afternoon in Frank's small apartment, watching Emma teach Lily and Rose how to make friendship bracelets using embroidery thread purchased from the dollar store. The three girls sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, their heads bent together over colorful strands while Emma patiently demonstrated the braiding technique she'd learned at the library's craft circle. "The secret is keeping the tension even," Emma explained with the serious tone of someone sharing important knowledge. "If you pull too tight, the bracelet won't lay flat, too loose, and it won't hold together properly." Lily and Rose hung on every word, treating Emma's craft instruction with the same attention they usually reserved for their private tutors and enrichment specialists. Victoria realized she was witnessing something she'd never provided for her daughters: the experience of learning from a peer who genuinely enjoyed teaching others, who shared knowledge for the simple pleasure of helping friends succeed. Frank emerged from the kitchen carrying glasses of lemonade made from powder and tap water, but served with the same care another host might offer imported wine. "How's the bracelet factory coming along?" he asked, distributing drinks to the three absorbed artists. "Emma's teaching us the advanced pattern," Rose announced proudly, holding up her partially completed bracelet for inspection. "Look, Daddy Frank, I'm making it in your favorite colors." Victoria noticed that Rose had unconsciously adopted Emma's habit of calling Frank Daddy Frank, a title that seemed to encompass both respect and affection. Frank accepted the honorary designation with the same natural grace he applied to everything else, treating Rose's bracelet with the serious appreciation her effort deserved. "That's beautiful, Rose. The color combination is perfect." Victoria found herself studying Frank's interaction with her daughters, noting the ease with which he navigated their emotional needs. He praised their efforts without empty flattery, offered gentle suggestions when they struggled with the technique, and most importantly, gave them his complete attention while they shared their creative process. This was the kind of focused presence Victoria struggled to provide, the ability to set aside professional concerns and be fully present for childhood moments that seemed insignificant but were actually foundational to healthy development. Frank made parenting look effortless, but Victoria was beginning to understand that his apparent ease came from consistent practice and genuine prioritization of Emma's needs above his own convenience. Dr. Ashworth, Emma said during a break in the bracelet-making session, "Daddy told me you own lots of hospitals. Does that mean you help sick people get better?" "That's right," Victoria said, settling onto the carpet beside the girls, despite her expensive silk blouse and tailored slacks. "We try to make sure people have access to good medical care when they need it." "Like when Lily and Rose needed help after the bus fire?" Emma asked, making connections with the logical thinking that characterized her approach to everything. "Exactly like that. Hospitals are places where people go when they're hurt or sick, and we want to make sure those places are available in every community." Emma considered this information with the serious expression she wore when processing complex concepts. "That's really important work. Daddy says helping people is the best kind of job you can have, even if it's hard sometimes." Victoria glanced at Frank, who was listening to this conversation with the quiet attention of someone who had taught his daughter to think about careers in terms of service rather than personal gain. "Your daddy is very wise. What kind of work do you think you'd like to do when you grow up?" "I want to be a scientist," Emma said without hesitation. "Maybe invent new medicines or find ways to clean up pollution. Something that helps lots of people at the same time." The scope of Emma's ambition, combined with her clear understanding of how individual work could contribute to community welfare, impressed Victoria deeply. This 8-year-old had already developed a more sophisticated understanding of professional purpose than many adults Victoria encountered in business settings. "Those are excellent goals," Victoria said. "Have you thought about what kind of education you'd need to become that kind of scientist?" Emma's expression became slightly wistful. "Mrs. Patterson says I should apply for the gifted program, but it's in Cedar Valley and we don't have reliable transportation. Daddy's exploring options, but it's complicated with his work schedule." Victoria had been thinking about Emma's educational situation since their first meeting, recognizing talent that deserved development regardless of economic constraints. The gifted program would provide academic challenges appropriate to Emma's intellectual capacity, but more importantly, it would connect her with other children who shared her curiosity and analytical thinking. "What if transportation wasn't an issue?" Victoria asked carefully. "Would you be interested in the advanced program?" "Really interested," Emma said, her face lighting up with enthusiasm. "They have laboratories and computer programming classes and field trips to universities." "It sounds amazing." Frank's expression showed the familiar conflict Victoria had learned to recognize in parents who wanted the best for their children but couldn't afford optimal opportunities. "Dr. Ashworth, I appreciate your concern, but Emma and I need to work through this situation ourselves. I don't want to create dependencies that we can't sustain long-term." Victoria understood Frank's position. The same pride that had made him refuse her initial offers of financial assistance extended to anything that might be perceived as charity. But she had been developing an idea that might address Emma's educational needs while respecting Frank's desire for independence and dignity. "What if I told you I've been considering establishing an educational foundation focused on gifted children in underserved communities?" Victoria said, choosing her words carefully. "The program would provide transportation, materials, and enrichment opportunities for academically talented students whose families meet certain criteria." Frank studied her face with the skeptical attention of someone who had learned to question offers that seemed too convenient. "This foundation, is it something you've been planning for a while or something you just thought of?" Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks at being caught in obvious manipulation. "I thought of it recently," she admitted, "but that doesn't make it less valid. There are dozens of children like Emma in communities throughout this region. Brilliant kids whose potential is limited by circumstances rather than ability. And this foundation would just happen to help Emma specifically?" "Emma would be one of many beneficiaries," Victoria said, recognizing that Frank deserved honesty rather than strategic positioning. "Yes, meeting her was what made me realize the need existed. But the program would serve children throughout the Ashworth Medical Network service area." Emma had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention of someone who understood that her future was being discussed in adult terms she needed to comprehend. "Daddy, if Dr. Ashworth wants to help lots of kids like me, isn't that a good thing, even if it helps us too?" Frank looked at his daughter, then at Lily and Rose, who were watching the discussion with the innocent curiosity of children who didn't understand economic complexity but recognized emotional tension. Victoria could see him weighing pride against opportunity, independence against his daughter's potential. "The foundation would have strict guidelines," Victoria continued, sensing an opening in Frank's resistance. "Academic merit, community service requirements, and family participation expectations. Nothing would be simply given. Everything would be earned through demonstrated commitment and achievement." "What kind of family participation?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting he was beginning to consider possibilities rather than just identifying problems. "Parent involvement in educational planning, community service projects, mentorship opportunities with other families. The foundation would build networks of support rather than just providing individual assistance." Frank was quiet for several minutes, watching Emma work on her friendship bracelets while processing Victoria's proposal. Finally, he looked up with the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision based on principles rather than convenience. "If you're serious about creating this foundation, really serious, not just as a way to help Emma specifically, then I'd be interested in learning more about the requirements and expectations." Victoria felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized was tense. "I'm completely serious. Emma deserves opportunities to develop her gifts, and so do dozens of other children in similar circumstances. This foundation could change lives." "Okay then," Frank said, extending his hand to shake on an agreement that felt more significant than a business contract. "Let's see what's possible when people work together, instead of just trying to solve everything alone." As Victoria shook Frank's calloused hand in his modest living room, surrounded by 3 children who had somehow become the center of an unlikely friendship, she realized she was about to embark on the most meaningful project of her professional life. The Ashworth Educational Foundation would help brilliant children like Emma, but it would also teach Victoria something essential about using resources for purposes that went beyond profit margins and corporate expansion. For the first time since building her medical empire, Victoria felt like she was about to create something that would matter in ways that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or shareholder value. The manila envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed uncomfortable with the nature of his errand and required Frank's signature on multiple forms. Frank recognized the law firm's letterhead before he opened it. Whitmore and Associates had handled Patricia's divorce proceedings and every subsequent custody modification she'd pursued over the past 3 years. The sight of their official stationery never brought good news. Inside, along with the expected legal documents, was a series of photographs that made Frank's stomach drop like a stone. They showed him and Victoria sitting together at the elementary school playground, deep in conversation while their children played in the background. Another captured them walking through downtown Millfield Heights, Emma between them holding both their hands like a family unit. A third showed Victoria entering his apartment building, time-stamped just 4 days ago. The images had been taken with a telephoto lens from considerable distance, capturing intimate moments between 2 people who appeared to be much more than casual acquaintances. To someone viewing these photographs without context, Frank and Victoria looked like a couple navigating the early stages of a relationship while their children bonded as a blended family. The custody petition that accompanied the photographs was thorough and devastating. Patricia was requesting full custody of Emma, claiming that Frank's recent association with individuals of extreme wealth and social prominence demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment that could expose Emma to inappropriate attention and unstable social dynamics beyond her ability to understand or navigate safely. The legal language was carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations while planting seeds of doubt about Frank's motives and character. According to the petition, Frank's friendship with Dr. Victoria Ashworth, whose personal net worth exceeded several $billions, represented either naive susceptibility to manipulation by sophisticated individuals or calculated positioning to gain access to resources and opportunities through his daughter's presence in elite social circles. Frank read through the document twice, each time feeling more sick to his stomach. Someone had been watching him, photographing his interactions with Victoria, building a case that his friendship with her somehow made him an unfit parent. The twisted logic would have been laughable if it weren't so potentially destructive. He was being accused of endangering Emma by associating with people who could provide her with opportunities and experiences he could never afford on his own. The phone rang before Frank had finished processing the implications of the petition. Patricia's voice carried the cold satisfaction of someone who believes she held all the winning cards. "I assume you've seen the papers by now," she said without preamble. "Patricia, what the hell is this? You're trying to take Emma away because I made friends with someone?" "I'm trying to protect Emma from a father who's clearly lost perspective," Patricia replied, her tone suggesting she genuinely believed her own argument. "Do you have any idea who Victoria Ashworth is? What her family represents? What kind of attention you're bringing down on our daughter?" Frank walked to the window and looked out at the apartment complex parking lot where his 15-year-old pickup truck sat next to a row of equally modest vehicles, owned by people who understood the reality of working multiple jobs to make ends meet. "She's a friend, Patricia, a good person whose children I helped in an emergency. She's a billionaire, Frank. Her decisions affect healthcare policy at the national level. She owns hospitals in 17 states and employs more people than the population of this entire town. And you think she's interested in genuine friendship with someone like you?" The casual cruelty of the assessment hit harder than Frank expected. Someone like me carried all the judgment and condescension that had characterized the final years of their marriage, when Patricia had grown increasingly frustrated with his contentment with blue-collar work and his failure to provide the kind of upward mobility she'd imagined when they'd married young and optimistic. "What do you want, Patricia?" "I want you to end whatever relationship you think you have with the Ashworth family. I want you to decline any offers of financial assistance or educational opportunities that might come from this association. And I want you to focus on being the kind of stable, predictable father that Emma deserves." Frank felt a surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm his usual careful control. "Emma is happy. She's thriving academically, she has friends, and she knows she's loved completely. What more do you want?" "I want her to have security. I want her to have opportunities. I want her to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to worry about whether there's enough money for groceries or whether her father's going to be able to pay the rent. Tom and I can provide all of that." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Patricia outlining her vision of Emma's future in language that made Frank's chest tighten with recognition of everything he couldn't provide. Private schools where Emma would be challenged academically and socially. College funds that would eliminate financial stress from her educational planning. Summer programs at prestigious institutions where she would meet children from appropriate families and develop networks that would serve her throughout her adult life. It was a compelling vision, Frank had to admit, and one that he would never be able to match despite his best efforts and deepest love. The brutal mathematics of single parenthood meant that Emma's potential would always be constrained by his limitations, no matter how hard he worked or how much he sacrificed for her welfare. After Patricia hung up, Frank sat in his kitchen staring at the legal documents and trying to understand how his life had become so complicated so quickly. 3 weeks ago, his biggest worry had been making sure Emma's school shoes lasted until spring. Now he was facing the possibility of losing custody of his daughter because he'd become friends with someone whose wealth apparently made him vulnerable to accusations of opportunism and poor judgment. The private investigator's report was attached to the custody petition, a comprehensive document that detailed Frank's daily routines, his work schedules, his financial struggles, and his growing relationship with Victoria. The report included photographs of their meetings, transcripts of overheard conversations, and analysis of their interactions that made innocent friendships sound like calculated manipulation, designed to gain access to resources and opportunities beyond Frank's natural social sphere. According to the investigator, Frank's refusal of Victoria's initial offers of financial assistance was strategic positioning, designed to build trust and create the impression of integrity rather than genuine humility. His willingness to share personal information about his circumstances was characterized as emotional manipulation, intended to generate sympathy and protective instincts. Even Emma's natural friendship with Lily and Rose was described as a convenient coincidence that provided ongoing access to the Ashworth family's resources and social connections. Frank had lived through the nightmare of Patricia's initial custody battle 3 years ago, had endured months of legal proceedings that scrutinized every aspect of his character and circumstances. But he had never felt as violated as he did reading this clinical dissection of his motives and relationships by someone who had never spoken to him, never witnessed his interactions with Emma, never understood the genuine affection that had developed between him and Victoria, despite their vastly different circumstances. The knock on his door came an hour later, just as Frank was trying to figure out how to explain the situation to Emma when she came home from school. He opened it to find Victoria standing in the hallway, her face showing the same mixture of shock and anger he was feeling. "You've seen the papers," she said, holding up her own copy of the custody petition. "How did you get them?" "Patricia's lawyer sent copies to my attorney as a professional courtesy, apparently, since I'm named as a correspondent in the action." Victoria stepped inside and closed the door behind her, her movements sharp with controlled fury. "This is insane, Frank. They're trying to use our friendship against you." Frank gestured toward the kitchen table where the documents were spread out like evidence in a crime scene. "It gets worse. There's a private investigator's report. Someone's been watching us, photographing our meetings, building a case that I'm some kind of gold digger using Emma to get access to your money." Victoria picked up the report and scanned through it, her expression growing darker with each page. "This is character assassination. None of this is true." "True doesn't matter if it sounds plausible to a family court judge," Frank said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had learned that legal proceedings operated on perception rather than reality. "Patricia's right about one thing. I can't provide for Emma the way she can. I work 2 jobs, and we still struggle sometimes. If the court decides that my association with you demonstrates poor judgment or instability—" "Then we fight it," Victoria interrupted. "We get better lawyers. We present the truth. We show the court what kind of father you really are and what our friendship actually means." Frank appreciated her instinctive loyalty, but he'd been through enough custody battles to understand the harsh mathematics of family law. "Victoria, you don't understand. Patricia has resources I can't match. She can drag this out for months, rack up legal bills I can't pay, make my life so difficult that Emma starts to suffer from the uncertainty. So you're just going to give up? Let them win? I'm going to protect my daughter. If that means ending our friendship to preserve my relationship with Emma, then that's what I have to do." Victoria stared at him as if he'd suggested something fundamentally incomprehensible. "You think the solution is to run away? To let Patricia dictate who you can and can't be friends with?" "I think the solution is to not give her any ammunition to use against me," Frank said, the words tasting bitter even as he spoke them. "This whole thing started because I saved Lily and Rose from that bus fire. If I had just minded my own business, kept my head down, focused on my own problems—" "Those children would be dead," Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose patience had reached its limit. "And Emma would have a father who taught her that helping others isn't worth the risk of personal consequences." Frank felt trapped between competing loyalties, his love for Emma and his growing feelings for Victoria, his desire to do the right thing, and his need to protect what remained of his carefully constructed life. The custody petition had revealed the fundamental vulnerability of his position, the way economic inequality could be weaponized by people who understood how to manipulate the legal system to their advantage. "I need time to think," he said finally, "to figure out how to handle this without making things worse for Emma." Victoria studied his face for a long moment, and Frank could see her processing the implications of his retreat, understanding that their friendship had become a liability he couldn't afford to maintain. "The educational foundation," she said quietly. "You want me to cancel it? I can't have my name associated with a public program if I'm fighting for custody. Patricia will use it as evidence that I'm more interested in personal recognition than in being a good father." "And our friendship? Emma's friendship with Lily and Rose?" Frank looked away, unable to meet her eyes while delivering words that felt like self-imposed exile from the best thing that had happened to his family in years. "I think it's better if we step back for a while, until the custody situation is resolved." "I see," Victoria said, her voice carefully neutral in the way it probably sounded during boardroom negotiations when personal feelings had to be set aside for strategic considerations. "And you think this will satisfy Patricia? That if you cut all ties with me, she'll drop the custody petition and leave Emma alone?" "I think it removes her primary argument against me. Without the Ashworth connection, I go back to being just another single father doing his best to raise his daughter." "Just another single father," Victoria repeated, as if testing the phrase for hidden meanings. "Is that really how you see yourself?" Frank considered the question, thinking about the man he'd been before the bus accident, before meeting Victoria and her children, before his world had expanded to include possibilities he'd never imagined. That man had been content with small victories and modest goals, had measured success in terms of stability rather than achievement, had built a life around the simple pleasure of coming home to Emma's smile at the end of each difficult day. "It's who I was before all this started," he said. "Maybe it's who I should have stayed." As Victoria prepared to leave, Frank realized he was about to lose something that had briefly made his life feel larger, richer, more connected to a community of people who shared his values, even if they didn't share his circumstances. But protecting Emma had to come first, even if it meant retreating to the smaller, safer world they had inhabited before heroism and friendship had complicated everything with hope and possibility. The silence in Frank's apartment had become oppressive during the 3 weeks since he'd ended contact with Victoria and her daughters. Emma moved through her daily routines with the subdued efficiency of someone who understood that asking too many questions might make an already difficult situation worse. But Frank could see the confusion and sadness in her green eyes every time she glanced at the phone that no longer rang with calls from Lily and Rose. "Daddy," Emma said one evening while they worked on her homework at the kitchen table, "did I do something wrong with Lily and Rose? Is that why they don't want to be friends anymore?" Frank set down the math worksheet he'd been reviewing and looked at his daughter. 8 years old, brilliant, generous-hearted, and now blaming herself for the adult complications that had torn apart the first genuine friendships she'd developed in months. The weight of his decision to retreat from the Ashworth family felt heavier every day, especially when he watched Emma's natural curiosity and enthusiasm dimming under the stress of losing connections that had made her world feel larger and more full of possibility. "You didn't do anything wrong, kiddo," Frank said, reaching across the table to take Emma's small hand in his work-roughened one. "Sometimes grown-up situations get complicated in ways that affect kids, even when the kids are perfect. But Dr. Ashworth was going to help with the foundation for smart kids like me. And Lily and Rose were teaching me how to braid friendship bracelets with the special pattern they learned at their fancy school. Now everything just stopped, and nobody explains why." Frank felt his chest tighten with guilt and frustration. Emma was too perceptive to accept vague explanations about adult complications, too intelligent not to recognize that her father was deliberately avoiding contact with people who had become important to both of them. She deserved honesty about what was happening, but how could he explain that their friendship with the Ashworth family was being used as evidence that he was an unfit parent? The custody hearing was scheduled for December 18th, 2 weeks before Christmas and 6 weeks after Frank had cut all contact with Victoria. His court-appointed lawyer, David Rodriguez, was earnest and well-meaning, but he'd been assigned to the case through the county's legal aid program, and his caseload included dozens of similar custody disputes involving parents who couldn't afford private representation. "The good news," David had explained during their preparation session, "is that your record since the divorce has been exemplary. 3 years of steady employment, no missed support payments, no violations of the custody agreement. Emma's academic performance and social development show clear evidence of a stable, nurturing home environment." "And the bad news?" Frank had asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The opposing counsel is going to paint a picture of someone whose judgment is compromised by association with people outside his social and economic class. They'll argue that your friendship with Dr. Ashworth represents a pattern of seeking inappropriate relationships for personal gain, even though you ended that friendship voluntarily." Frank had read through Patricia's legal arguments so many times he could recite them from memory. According to her petition, his sudden involvement with prominent community members suggested instability and poor decision-making. The fact that he'd initially declined Victoria's offers of financial assistance was characterized as strategic manipulation, designed to build trust before eventual exploitation. Even his decision to end the friendship was twisted into evidence of guilt and recognition that the relationship had been inappropriate from the beginning. "What about Emma's preferences?" Frank had asked. "She's 8 years old. Doesn't the court consider what she wants?" "They'll interview her, but custody decisions are based on the child's best interests, not necessarily their stated preferences. An 8-year-old can't be expected to understand complex financial and social factors that might affect her long-term welfare." Now sitting at his kitchen table while Emma struggled with long division problems that seemed simple compared to the adult mathematics of custody law, Frank wondered if he was making the right choice or simply the safe one. Protecting Emma meant preserving their small, carefully controlled life, but it also meant denying her opportunities that could transform her educational future and social development. The phone rang at 8:30 p.m., interrupting Frank's thoughts as he helped Emma prepare for bed. He answered expecting a work-related call, or possibly a wrong number, but Victoria's voice came through the receiver with an urgency that made his pulse quicken immediately. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you throwing away our friendship because you're afraid of what people will think? Or because you genuinely believe Emma would be better off without Lily and Rose in her life? Frank was quiet for a moment, surprised by the directness of her question and unprepared for the flood of emotions that hearing her voice brought to the surface. Victoria, we agreed that stepping back was the best way to protect Emma from— We didn't agree on anything, Victoria interrupted. You decided that running away was easier than fighting for something that mattered to all of our children. I'm asking you now, as Emma's father and as someone I thought I knew, whether you really believe this isolation is what's best for her. Frank looked toward Emma's bedroom, where she was probably lying awake listening to his conversation and hoping for news about the friends she missed desperately. What I believe doesn't matter if the court decides that my association with you demonstrates poor judgment. Patricia has resources I can't match, legal strategies I can't counter. If she wins this custody battle because I was too stubborn to recognize the risk, then we make sure she doesn't win, Victoria said with the firm decisiveness he remembered from their first meeting. Frank, I've been doing research on custody law, talking to family court judges, consulting with the best attorneys in the state. Patricia's case is built on perception and prejudice, not on any evidence that you're actually an inadequate parent. Perception matters in family court. If the judge believes that my friendship with you shows poor judgment, then we present evidence of your actual judgment, your parenting skills, your dedication to Emma's welfare, your character and values, as demonstrated by everyone who knows you personally. We fight this thing with truth instead of hiding from lies. Frank felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for weeks, the same instinct that had driven him to dive into the burning bus, the recognition that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal risk involved. Victoria, you don't understand what you're offering. If you testify on my behalf, Patricia's lawyers will go after your character too. They'll question your motives, your judgment, maybe even your fitness as a parent. Let them try, Victoria said with quiet steel in her voice. I've been cross-examined by hostile board members and investigative journalists. I think I can handle a small-town lawyer who's trying to destroy a good man's relationship with his daughter. It could affect your business reputation, your hospital network, everything you've built. Everything I've built means nothing if I can't use it to help people who matter to me. Emma matters to me, Frank. Your friendship matters to me. Lily and Rose have been asking about Emma every day for 3 weeks, and I'm tired of making excuses about why she can't visit anymore. Frank felt the walls he'd built around his fear beginning to crack under the pressure of Victoria's determination and his own recognition that retreating hadn't actually solved anything. Patricia's custody petition was still pending, Emma was still suffering from the loss of her friends, and he was still facing the possibility of losing his daughter despite his attempts to avoid conflict through isolation. If I agree to fight this thing, Frank said slowly, I need to know that you understand what you're getting into. Patricia will use every resource she has to make me look unstable, manipulative, unfit to raise Emma. They'll twist our friendship into something it isn't, question every decision I've made, attack my character in ways designed to make me look like I'm using my daughter to gain access to your wealth. Then we show them who you really are, Victoria said simply. We present evidence of the kind of father Emma knows you to be, the kind of man who risks his life to save children he's never met, who works 2 jobs to provide for his daughter, who teaches her values that money can't buy. Frank thought about Emma's science project, still displayed on their dining room table, her research into renewable energy sources driven by genuine curiosity and desire to help solve environmental problems. He thought about her natural empathy with struggling classmates, her excitement about learning, her unconscious assumption that adults should help children whenever possible. Emma had learned those values from watching him, from seeing how he approached work and relationships and community responsibility. If Patricia's lawyers wanted to examine his character, let them look at the evidence of how he'd raised his daughter, with love, integrity, and commitment to principles that transcended economic circumstances. Okay, Frank said, feeling something shift inside him like a weight lifting from his chest. Let's fight for this. Let's show them what real family values look like. Are you sure? Victoria asked, though her voice carried relief and determination. Once we commit to this battle, there's no backing down. We see it through to the end, whatever that means. Frank looked around his small apartment. The modest furniture, the carefully maintained appliances, the walls covered with Emma's artwork and academic achievements. This was a home built on love rather than money, sustained by values rather than resources, proof that the most important things in life couldn't be purchased with any amount of wealth. "I'm sure," he said, "Emma deserves a father who fights for what matters, who doesn't let other people dictate what kind of relationships we're allowed to have. And she deserves friends who care about her for who she is, not what her family can provide." As Frank hung up the phone and went to check on Emma, who was probably lying awake hoping for news about Lily and Rose, he realized he was about to enter the most important battle of his life. Not just for custody of his daughter, but for the principle that good people should be allowed to help each other regardless of their economic circumstances. That children's friendships shouldn't be subject to adult prejudices about social class and appropriate associations. Tomorrow he would call David Rodriguez and inform him that they were going to fight Patricia's custody petition with everything they had. They would present evidence of Frank's character, call witnesses who could testify about his parenting abilities, and demonstrate that love and dedication mattered more than financial resources when it came to raising confident, compassionate children. But tonight, Frank was going to tell Emma that Lily and Rose had been missing her just as much as she'd been missing them, and that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that felt most dangerous to fight. The Hamilton County Courthouse was a granite monument to justice built in 1847, its high ceilings and polished marble floors designed to inspire respect for the legal process and the weight of decisions made within its walls. Frank had never been inside the building before the custody proceedings began, and he found the formal atmosphere both intimidating and oddly reassuring. A place where evidence mattered more than wealth, where character could be evaluated based on actions rather than bank account balances. Judge Catherine Morrison had presided over family court cases for 18 years, long enough to recognize every variation of custody dispute that human nature could devise. At 59, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who understood that her decisions shaped children's futures and took that responsibility with profound seriousness. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for legal manipulation and theatrical presentations designed to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. Frank sat at the respondent's table beside David Rodriguez, wearing the one suit he owned, purchased for job interviews 4 years ago and carefully maintained for occasions that required formal presentation. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, but packed with an intensity that made every whispered conversation feel magnified. Every shuffling of papers sound like thunder in the charged atmosphere. Across the aisle, Patricia sat with her attorney, Marcus Whitmore III, whose expensive clothing and confident demeanor suggested he was accustomed to winning cases through superior resources rather than superior arguments. Patricia looked polished and professional in a way that emphasized the contrast between her current circumstances and Frank's modest appearance. But Frank noticed tension in her posture that suggested she understood this battle would be more difficult than her previous legal victories. Emma was not in the courtroom. Family court proceedings typically excluded children under 12 unless their direct testimony was required. But Frank could feel her presence in every document, every piece of evidence, every argument that would determine whether they continued building their life together or whether that life was fundamentally altered by judicial decree. "Your Honor," Whitmore began in his opening statement, "this case is about providing Emma Miller with the stability and opportunities that every child deserves. Ms. Patricia Henderson and her husband Thomas can offer Emma a 2-parent household, financial security, educational advantages, and a social environment that will prepare her for success in an increasingly competitive world." Frank listened to the familiar arguments about private schools and college funds, enrichment programs, and social connections, all the advantages that money could purchase for a child whose future stretched ahead with unlimited possibility. Whitmore was skilled at painting a picture of abundance without explicitly criticizing Frank's circumstances, suggesting through careful language that love alone was insufficient when weighed against practical considerations of long-term welfare and social advancement. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, "recent events have raised serious questions about Mr. Miller's judgment and priorities. His association with individuals of extreme wealth and social prominence, while perhaps well-intentioned, demonstrates a pattern of seeking relationships that may expose Emma to complexities and pressures inappropriate for a child her age." The argument was subtle but devastating, suggesting that Frank's friendship with Victoria was somehow inappropriate or exploitative, without directly making accusations that could be challenged with evidence. Whitmore was too experienced to make claims he couldn't prove, instead relying on implication and suggestion to plant seeds of doubt about Frank's motives and character. When David Rodriguez rose for his opening statement, Frank felt a moment of concern about the contrast between his young public defender and Whitmore's polished professionalism. But David's voice carried conviction that transcended his relative inexperience, and his words focused on the heart of the matter rather than peripheral considerations. Your Honor, this case is not about money or social status or educational opportunities that can be purchased with sufficient resources. This case is about the bond between a father and daughter who have built a life together based on love, trust, and mutual respect. Emma Miller is thriving in her current environment, academically, socially, and emotionally, because she has a father who prioritizes her well-being above his own comfort and convenience. David gestured toward the character references in school records that documented Emma's consistent academic performance, her involvement in school activities, her healthy social development under Frank's care. Mr. Miller has been sober for 3 years, has maintained steady employment despite economic challenges, has never missed a support payment or custody visit. He has rebuilt his life around his commitment to being the father Emma deserves. The first witness Patricia called was Dr. Rebecca Lawson, a child psychologist who specialized in custody evaluations. Dr. Lawson had interviewed both Frank and Patricia, had observed Emma's interactions with both parents, and had prepared a comprehensive report that was ostensibly neutral, but seemed to favor Patricia's position on several key points. In my professional opinion, Dr. Lawson testified, Emma would benefit from the additional resources and stability that Ms. Emter can provide. While Mr. Miller is clearly devoted to his daughter, single parenthood places inherent stresses on both parent and child that can be alleviated through alternative arrangements that provide broader support systems. Under cross-examination, David managed to establish that Dr. Lawson had spent only 90 minutes observing Frank and Emma together compared to 3 hours with Patricia and Emma, and that her report relied heavily on financial analysis rather than emotional attachment assessment. But the damage was done. An expert witness had suggested that Emma's current situation was less than optimal and that change might benefit her long-term development. Patricia's testimony came next, delivered with the controlled emotion of someone who had rehearsed her presentation carefully. She spoke about her regrets over the divorce, her desire to provide Emma with a stable two-parent household, her concern that Frank's recent association with prominent community members suggested poor judgment about appropriate relationships and social boundaries. I don't question Frank's love for Emma, Patricia said, looking directly at Judge Morrison, but love isn't enough when a child's future is at stake. Emma deserves opportunities that Frank simply cannot provide, no matter how hard he works or how much he cares. She deserves educational advantages, social connections, and financial security that will open doors throughout her adult life. Frank watched Patricia testify and recognized the woman he'd married 12 years ago, intelligent, articulate, genuinely concerned about Emma's welfare, even when that concern was filtered through assumptions about what constituted appropriate parenting and suitable social environments. She wasn't motivated by malice or revenge, which somehow made her arguments more dangerous because they carried the ring of sincere conviction about what would be best for their daughter. During cross-examination, David focused on Patricia's decision to pursue full custody rather than modified visitation, questioning whether her primary concern was Emma's welfare or her own desire for control over her daughter's upbringing and social development. Ms. Henderson, in your petition you cite Mr. Miller's association with Dr. Victoria Ashworth as evidence of poor judgment. Can you explain why friendship with a successful law-abiding citizen who has contributed significantly to community healthcare would be problematic for Emma's development? Patricia hesitated, recognizing the trap in the question. It's not the friendship itself that concerns me. It's the circumstances that led to the friendship, the media attention, the way Emma might be affected by being thrust into social situations she's not prepared to navigate successfully. Are you suggesting that Mr. Miller should have allowed 2 children to drown rather than risk the social complications that might result from saving their lives? Of course not, Patricia said, her composure slipping slightly, but Frank has always had difficulty maintaining appropriate boundaries. His association with the Ashworth family feels like another example of that pattern, exposing Emma to complexities that go beyond what an 8-year-old should have to process. Frank felt his anger rise at the casual dismissal of his heroic act, the way Patricia could acknowledge that he'd saved 2 children's lives while simultaneously using that action as evidence against his character and judgment. But David was already moving to his next line of questioning. establishing that Patricia had remarried within 18 months of their divorce, while limiting Frank's contact with Emma during that transitional period. The morning session concluded with Thomas Henderson's testimony about his willingness to serve as Emma's stepfather, his financial resources, and his vision for her educational and social future. Thomas was earnest and well-meaning, clearly fond of Emma and genuinely interested in her welfare, but his testimony felt rehearsed and theoretical compared to the lived experience of daily parenting that Frank had accumulated over 8 years of raising his daughter as a single father. During the lunch recess, Frank sat with David in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse, reviewing their strategy for the afternoon session when Frank would testify on his own behalf, followed by his character witnesses and concluding with Victoria's testimony, the strategic decision to end their case on what David believed would be their strongest possible note. "Remember," David said, reviewing his notes and preparing Frank for what would likely be the most stressful experience of his life, "Whitmore is going to try to provoke you, to make you appear defensive or unstable. Stay calm, answer the questions directly, and don't elaborate unless I ask you to. Your job is to show Judge Morrison who you really are, not to debate the opposing counsel's interpretation of your actions or motivations." Frank nodded, understanding the advice but knowing that staying calm under hostile questioning would be one of the most difficult challenges he'd ever faced. Everything he cared about, his relationship with Emma, their future together, the life they'd built through love and determination and daily commitment to each other's welfare, would be determined by his ability to present himself as competent and credible under the most stressful circumstances imaginable. Esther. As they prepared to return to the courtroom for the afternoon session, Frank thought about Emma, probably eating lunch at school with no idea that her future was being decided by strangers who would weigh her happiness against abstract considerations of long-term welfare and social appropriateness. He thought about Victoria, somewhere in the courthouse preparing to risk her own reputation and privacy to testify on behalf of a man she'd known for less than 4 months, motivated by friendship and principles rather than self-interest or obligation. And he thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago compared to the man he'd become through sobriety, hard work, and the daily practice of putting Emma's needs ahead of his own comfort and convenience. The afternoon session would determine which version of Frank Miller the court would accept as real, which narrative would shape Emma's future, and whether the love between a father and daughter was strong enough to withstand the complex forces that threatened to separate them permanently. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.